I invite you now to hear these words from 1 Corinthians, the verse that has been our theme verse throughout Project 162, and the verse preceding it from the 16th chapter. Now concerning the collection for the saints, you should follow the directions that I gave to the churches of Galatia. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside and save whatever extra you can, so that collections need not be taken when I come. Amen. Joan woke up and hit the snooze button. More than once she hit the snooze button, again and again. And every time she hit it, she found herself waking up to a new set of commercials on the alarm radio. She rolled over and grabbed her phone and started flipping through social media, subconsciously receiving another dozen or two ads as she did. She flipped on the radio while she was taking a shower, listening to some more commercials, and then the TV while she was cooking her breakfast and lunch, of course, seeing and hearing a few more. She passed by a stack of mail on her table that was filled mostly with credit card offers and appeals for nonprofits for their end-of-the-year giving. She knew that at the end of the day, her mailbox would have just as high a stack today. She drove on the way to work, and as she did so, she passed billboard after billboard after billboard, each one changing every few seconds to make sure to maximize the appeals for her dollars. She walked into the office building, and before she could make it into her office, she had received 3 more appeals for how she should spend her money. The co-worker's kid who's selling wreaths for Christmas for scouts. The opportunity to give to the company's charity that everybody else was giving to. The chance to throw in a few bucks for a Christmas party for a co-worker that was getting ready to retire. All of these opportunities that she had hand over fist. And as she sat down at her computer, the logo emblazoned in 3 places on it. She fired it up to the bank account as she saw online that once again the numbers were red. It was no surprise when she sees the frenzied activity that she is invited to participate in, the ways she is demanded to spend. Now, Joan is not alone, is she? How many of us can relate to the number of times we are invited to give money to somebody in our lives? How many times we hear this kind of this frenzied appeal again and again and again throughout our lives? Some studies will suggest that anywhere between 3,000 and 20,000 times a day we hear an appeal for money. Maybe it's subtle, like a logo on a piece of clothing, or maybe it's very clear and demanding, like some of us receive on a regular basis. But in this lifestyle we lead, it causes us to have this frenzied attitude, does it not? For all of these people suggest indeed that if you give money to me, you'll feel better. And we don't. We don't, because just like Joan, we feel guilty that we can't live within our means, that we have to say no to some, if not most, of those requests. And we feel our heart broken again and again, guilty again and again. It is a way that psychologists tell us that this frenzy has an impact on our lives. It has an impact on our emotional health, on our mental health, as we continue to deal with that guilt and that stress. All of those things then have an impact on our physical health. How many people do we know have had physical problems because of their money anxiety, their money stress? It causes relational stress as well. How many marriages have fallen apart? How many families absorb that stress about having things or having enough money, fighting over the bills? Now, sometimes we try to fix it, right? With this cycle. The cycle is something like, it feels bad. I'm sad that I don't have as much money as I want, or that I now I'm in the hole again. Now another check is bounced. So what should I do? Well, maybe I'll feel better if I go shopping. Or if I go out to eat. Yeah, that's what I deserve a break today. And of course, the spiral continues deeper and deeper and deeper. And we all do it. So many of us caught up in this frenzy. This emotional and relational and physical exhaustion. Well, it's not completely unlike what we read in the book of Corinthians. The book of Corinthians speaks of this frenzy in different terms, but it is still a frenzied state. The city of Corinth was very much a busy place. And so perhaps the number of requests for time and for attention and for money were just as common as they are in our time today. It was a busy port city with a lot of merchants all around. And so as you walked from your home into the house church, members of this congregation would perhaps have heard all of these different marketplace vendors asking them in the same way, in this frenzied state, you should give your money to me. Meanwhile, the church at Corinth dealt with this cultural phenomenon of boasting. So it wasn't simply a matter of spending or giving away money, but it was a matter of telling other people how much you had, or how powerful you were, or how smart you were. It was part of the culture to suggest that you stood on the street corner and told everybody how great you were. It was a matter of raising higher and higher and higher stakes. Not only that, but Corinth was the site of a kind of a church-wide emphasis, a church-wide concern about how we should follow the old ways. Should we all become followers of the practices of circumcision and of the feasts and of all of those old ways? Or should we not live by those old ways, but live by the new ways? This kind of frenzied answer, this frenzied confusion between different parts of the congregation came home to roost. All of this anxiety came home to roost in a church that was weary. And it was a church that Paul spoke to, writing a letter now. A letter to bring hope. A letter to bring joy. In this letter, what Paul does is he works hard to bring about a sense of rootedness to the people of Corinth. They see the frenzy all around them, and instead they find a rootedness. There in Corinth, Paul writes chapter after chapter after chapter about how this rootedness changes the way that we live. He talks about the way we must be rooted in Christ. We must be rooted in the grace that Christ brings us. We must be rooted in resurrection. That's how he kind of ends chapter 15. As he goes through the entire book, we read in chapter 12 about how we are rooted together in community. Each of us has our own gifts. Each of us has our own abilities. All of these together come together for what Paul calls the body of Christ. We are rooted together in this. Chapter 13 speaks of love. That's how we are rooted together. And then he goes on in chapter 16. Now, a lot of times we'll read these last chapter of Paul's letters and just kind of slough over them, right? They get these subject headings with inspiring titles like Other Matters, or details that Paul had to share with the congregation. And so we don't really pay attention to them. But I would suggest that what we read today in chapter 16 is a fascinating look at what was going on behind the scenes in the church in general and in the congregation in Corinth specifically. Because what they did was they collected an offering. Now, this seems pretty obvious for those who have been in church long. We do those kinds of things. But this was a very specific kind of offering. It seems that a lot of the churches that Paul had started, the one in Corinth, the one in Galatia, a lot of those in Macedonia were growing and they were strong and people were coming to them and rich merchants were there, and so they were well off financially. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, back in the mother church, back in the place where the faith began, back in the place that the first disciples began to tell the story at Pentecost, the congregation struggled. They were older. It was an older congregation, and many of its members were not able to give. They were struggling because the whole area was economically depressed. Palestine had been kind of under the thumb of Rome in particular, and so this area was struggling in general. And then those who were in the church, those who were in the congregation, were pointed at by those in the religious establishment in that day, and they were yelled and shouted down again and again. They received the most abuse. It was hard to be a part of that church, and those that were there were struggling economically and emotionally, and so Paul said, we will all help. We are rooted in this place. We are rooted in the love that remembers from whence we came. We remember the mother church, and we remember those in need. That's why we are here. And so he makes this appeal to the church at Corinth. He makes this appeal to the church at Galatia. All of these different churches. I will collect this offering when I come, and then I will take it to Jerusalem. But then the way he does it speaks of his idea of rootedness. He says, what I will do is I will not simply come and show up on a Sunday morning and guilt trip you into a few more dollars to take down the road. No, what I want you to do is I want you to collect these funds each and every week. Every time when you gather in worship, collect these funds. Make it a regular part of what you do. His idea of rootedness is in the living of life. That's why I love chapter 16 and chapters like that, because it speaks of very pedantic matters and very normal matters and very ordinary matters, which prove that God is in those too. God is even in our collected offerings. And so Paul speaks to them to be regular in their giving, to be generous in their giving. He says, give everything that you have, everything that you can spare into this offering, because there are those in need. He reminds the Corinthians what is important about their faith and how it is important to share with others out of that rootedness. Now, of course, I think this is a meaningful word for us as well. To understand this idea of rootedness and how we as a faith, as we as people, as we as a community here, understand what it's like to come out of that community and care for those in need. To care for the ministries of our community and of our church. You know, I know it's completely anachronistic, but the metaphor that comes to mind when I hear Paul's idea here of this offering is mowing my lawn. So my guess is that you mow your lawn kind of like I mow my lawn, right? There's only a couple different ways to mow it, right? Now, I guess you could be really creative, and you could say, let me fire up the mower, and then let me just look around and see which part of the lawn looks tallest. Let me go and mow that first. Oh, no, I was wrong. It's actually over here. I'm going to mow some of this first, too. And after I mow this a little bit and say, I don't know, have I mowed over there? Let me just mow it again just to make sure, right? We don't mow that way, right? None of us do. How do we mow? We mow in straight lines, back and forth. Some of us get fancy and do like a 45-degree angle. Some of us like do maybe a header around the edge. But there's a plan. There's an expectation of how we're going to do it the same way. But how many of us in our giving mow like the first person? Well, yeah, I'll just give a little bit to this. Well, they asked me, so I think I should write a check to them too. So, have I paid this bill yet? I don't know if I paid this bill yet. And we are scattered and we are separated and we live a frenzied life just like the frenzied lawnmower. Is there a way that we can be rooted in our stewardship? rooted in the way that we think about how then might we give. It's the way that Paul said 2,000 years ago they were doing this. Have a plan, prepare, think about how you'll do it, and stick to it week after week after week. That's why we're here today. That's why we're doing this Project 162 conversation. It's because we know of the importance of a plan. But that's not the only reason we're here today. I have loved the way our Project 162 leadership has talked about this stuff. Because they've done it not in a way of obligation, not guilt-trippy, not if you don't pledge, then Jesus doesn't love you anymore. They haven't stood up here and said, here's 7 different reasons that you should tithe every week and 7 different guilt trips if you don't. Instead, they've stood up here and talked about this community. They've talked about their memories here. I've talked about what matters in this place. Sarah and Bill, Ken and Craig, they've all talked about why this place matters to them, why they're rooted here. In a few minutes you'll hear the same from Anne. And they remind us of the importance of this place, the importance of why we come together in the first place. Yes, there's an importance to the rootedness of coming together and remembering why we give. The team's been great at that too. They've been talked about for the last several weeks, last several months really. They've talked about how important it is to think ahead, to plan ahead. As we pull together our capital giving and our budget giving, it's important to pledge. It's important to think about what are our needs in the future. These are all important things to do. I've loved the way that the prayer team has rooted all of it in prayer. Have they not done a great job with the devotional book and with the bookmark and the prayer points every single week, reminding us we should be rooted in prayer and in our faith. And as they do it, as each of them reminds us of the power of this, it's just like Paul said 2,000 years ago. Have a plan. Be consistent. Be generous. That's why we gather. Because of the rootedness of our faith. Because of the importance of community. We too think of those who are in need in our world. Maybe it's not the Jerusalem church anymore, but we know who it is. We know those in need in our own world, in our own city, in our own state. And so we gather in this place. And we live a life of rootedness in this place. One final story. Actually, another kind of metaphor, perhaps. Some of you know that we have 2 dogs. Now, our dogs could not be more different. The first is a terrier mix. And if you know anything about terriers, you know that terriers tend to be definitions of the word frenzy. When the terrier wants to go outside, it looks something like this. Before I open the back door, the terrier has run to the door and has pawed and scratched at the door to go out as soon as possible to go out into the backyard. As I open the door, he explodes out of the back door. He jumps off of the deck 15 feet up in the air, and then he runs around at everything that he could find in the yard, everything that is moving. So he goes after that squirrel, and then he goes after that rabbit, and then he tries to jump up and grab that bird, and all over the place. And then when all of the living things are gone, he starts going at anything else that's moving, especially in the fall when there are leaves falling off the trees. So here's that leaf over here, and there's that leaf over here, and he's running all over the place. And then when everything has stopped moving in the yard, he starts to dig a hole to see if there's anything moving underground so he can get that too. He's the definition of frenzy, and so he's always exhausted. He is hungry, he is thirsty all the time out of that frenzy. Our second dog is a poodle. When I open the door for the poodle, he walks out, makes a circle, and comes right back. If he does happen to go to the bathroom, he takes a little bit, but then comes right back. If I happen to go outside on the back deck with him, as soon as I sit on the deck chair, he's in my lap. And he will not leave until I stand up. Even then, he'll look at me and say, "Are you going to sit down again?" He is the definition of rooted. He knows where his lap is. He knows what it means to belong there. Today I invite you to a poodle way of life. I invite you to the rootedness of knowing that indeed there is one in whose lap you may now sit, who loves you, who cares for you, who created you, who knows you better than you know yourself. We have a special place here, a special community of love and care. May we together be rooted in this place, following the God that loves us dearly, enjoying the lap of care as together we give.